The summer of 1941 marked one of the darkest turning points in modern military history. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was intended as a lightning campaign. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht swept across the western USSR, overwhelming defenses, smashing entire Soviet armies, and capturing city after city. By the end of August, German records claimed nearly 872,000 Soviet prisoners of war had been taken. This figure alone was staggering. One-third of the Red Army stationed in the West when the war began, erased in just over 2 months. Add to that, another 1.4 million dead and almost 700,000 wounded, and the scale of destruction becomes almost unimaginable. In comparison, the entire Imperial Russian Army suffered 9 million casualties across 4 years of the First World War. Now, in just 9 weeks, Stalin's Red Army had already endured a third of that toll. But this was not merely numbers on paper. Each figure represented shattered units, desperate families, and men herded into captivity, where survival was unlikely. German logistics could not cope with the flood of prisoners, and the Nazi regime had no intention of feeding them properly. In many camps, Soviet captives received as little as 100 grams of bread per day, barely enough to keep a man alive. Starvation became a deliberate policy, and by the end of the year, less than 1 in 3 Soviet prisoners would remain alive. And yet, in the midst of this catastrophe, the Soviet state did not collapse. Moscow ordered new armies to be raised, swelling the total strength to around 6.7 million men by the end of summer. These fresh divisions lacked training, weapons, and coordination, but they slowly absorbed the hard lessons of battle. From the ranks of survivors emerged hardened sergeants, young lieutenants, and junior commanders who learned how to resist. Stalin's war machine was battered, bleeding, but not broken. As August ended, the Red Army still stood in the field. For Hitler, this was both an obstacle and an opportunity. By late August, Army Group Center, the German spearhead, aimed toward Moscow, was exhausted. The advance had stalled around Smolensk, and for the first time, the Wehrmacht encountered the reality that Soviet resistance would not simply melt away. Hitler faced a critical choice: push directly on Moscow, or turn his armored forces south to encircle the Soviet armies defending Ukraine. Against the advice of many generals, he chose Kyiv. For this task, he unleashed his most dynamic commander, General Heinz Guderian. Guderian's reputation as the father of modern blitzkrieg tactics had been cemented in France the year before. Now, Hitler demanded he execute an even more audacious strike. Instead of continuing east toward Moscow, Guderian's panzers wheeled south, aiming to cut off the Soviet southwestern front by linking with General Kleist's armor pushing north. From the Dnipro River, the stakes were immense. Success would mean the destruction of another 500,000 Soviet troops, the capture of Ukraine's fertile heartlands, and the elimination of the Red Army's strongest front. Failure, however, risked overextending Germany's precious panzer divisions and delaying the march on Moscow until winter. On the Soviet side, the man chosen to stop Guderian was General Andrei Eremenko, commander of the Bryansk front. His orders were stark: block the panzer thrust at all costs. Eremenko inherited shattered formations, demoralized soldiers, and little time to reorganize. Yet he understood the importance of his task. If Guderian broke through Kyiv, the entire southwestern front would be doomed. The battle that followed would test the limits of both German daring and Soviet endurance. On August 26, 1941, Guderian's vanguard struck at the town of Novgorod-Seversky, where a great bridge spanned the Desna River. The 3rd Panzer Division, under General Walter Model, stormed the crossing in a lightning assault. Against all odds, the Germans seized the bridge intact, a golden prize in any armored advance. Model himself rushed to the front to oversee the action. Within hours, Soviet artillery rained down on the crossing, killing senior officers and wounding. Model. The bridge survived, but the Germans found themselves clinging precariously to their gains. Eremenko reacted swiftly. Soviet counterattacks hammered the German bridgehead, forcing parts of the 10th Infantry Division back across the river. For a moment, it appeared the Red Army might hold. Soviet aviation joined the fight, with waves of bombers striking German columns at night, but poor coordination and weak training blunted the effort, while the Luftwaffe reasserted dominance in the skies. Meanwhile, Guderian's frustration grew. He demanded reinforcements from Army Group Center Commander Fedor von Bock. Bock resisted, desperately needing his own reserves to contain Zhukov's gathering strength around Smolensk. Only after relentless pressure did he release elite units. including the Grossdeutschland Regiment and the SS Division Reich, to Guderian's command. With these reinforcements, Schweppenberg's the 24th Panzer Corps regrouped for another push. The struggle for the Desna was just beginning, and both sides knew that whoever controlled the crossings would dictate the fate of Kyiv, while Guderian fought at the Desna. The Eastern Front stretched like a bleeding wound across thousands of miles. To the north, Army Group North drove relentlessly toward Leningrad. On August 24th, the city of Luga fell. Soon after, German panzers cut the vital Moscow-Leningrad railway, severing the city's last lifeline. By the 30th, the town of Mga was captured, isolating Leningrad completely. The siege had begun, a siege that would last for more than 900 days. Yet, even in this grim hour, moments of defiance emerged. Near Krasnogvardsk, Lieutenant Kalabonov led a mere platoon of KV-1 tanks into ambush positions. When the 8th Panzer Division advanced, his heavy tanks unleashed devastation. By the time the guns fell silent, nearly 40 German tanks lay smoldering. One platoon had brought an entire Panzer Division to a halt. Proof that Soviet courage and cunning could still sting the WEHR, MACHT. In the center, Marshal Georgy Zhukov reorganized battered Soviet armies around Smolensk. Unlike many of his colleagues, Zhukov did not hesitate to demand reinforcements from Stalin himself. Incredibly, Stalin agreed, granting Zhukov reserves to prepare for an assault on the Yelnya salient. Here, Soviet forces planned a counterstrike that would, for the first time in the war, force the Germans into retreat. It was a small step, but symbolically vital. The Red Army was learning to fight back, but while Zhukov gathered strength, Stalin's gaze and Hitler's remained fixed. On Ukraine, the drama unfolding around Kyiv overshadowed all else. Both leaders understood that the fate of entire armies, and perhaps the trajectory of the war, would be decided there. As Guderian pressed southward, General Ewald von Kleist advanced north. From the lower Dnipro, his mission was simple in theory. Cross the river, swing wide around Kyiv, and meet Guderian's armor to close the trap. In practice, it was anything but simple. The Dnipro was vast, its crossings heavily defended, and the Soviet 38th Army was thrown into the line to block him. At Dnipropetrovsk and beyond, Soviet soldiers, many of them newly conscripted and barely trained, fought with desperate determination. They lacked proper weapons and suffered under relentless Luftwaffe bombing. But their stubborn resistance slowed Kleist's advance. By the end of August, Rundstedt himself ordered the Panzer Group to pause and regroup, wary of overextension. Still, bridgeheads had been established, and the jaws of the encirclement were beginning to close. North of Kyiv, meanwhile, Rykhanov's 6th Army struggled to maintain its positions. Soviet counterattacks forced German divisions back across the river in places. The Soviet 5th Army fought stubbornly, clinging to the Dnipro line even as pressure mounted from both flanks. Yet everyone on the ground knew what was coming. Guderian was still advancing from the north. Kleist was regrouping in the south, and the city of Kyiv stood directly in the middle of the German trap. Inside Kyiv, General Mikhail Kerponas, commander of the Soviet Southwestern Front, faced an impossible choice. He saw the German pincers closing and knew that retreat was the only way to save his army. Yet retreat required permission from Moscow, and Stalin refused. For the Soviet dictator, Kyiv was more than a military position. It was a symbol, a historic city, and a political prize he would not surrender without a fight. Orders were clear: hold Kyiv at all costs. Kerponas obeyed, but with a heavy heart. His soldiers dug trenches, built defenses, and braced for the inevitable, knowing they were being asked to fight a battle that could not be won. Around them, the city prepared for war. Civilians joined in fortifying positions. Women and children dug anti-tank ditches, and factories churned out whatever weapons they could produce. Kyiv became a fortress, but one already surrounded by storm clouds. For Stalin, the decision was an assertion of will. For his commanders, it was a death sentence for thousands of men. Hitler, meanwhile, watched with grim satisfaction. If Stalin refused to withdraw, then the destruction of the Southwestern Front was all but guaranteed. The trap was set, and all that remained was to close it. By the final days of August, the stage was prepared for one of the largest encirclements in military history. Guderian, reinforced and determined, pushed across the Desna, driving south with relentless momentum. Kleist regrouped after his river crossings, prepared to surge north. Between them lay the bulk of the Soviet Southwestern Front, hundreds of thousands of men, unaware that their fate was already sealed. For the Germans, Kyiv promised a decisive victory. It would mean another massive haul of prisoners, the collapse of Soviet defenses in Ukraine, and the freeing of German divisions for the march on Moscow. For the Soviets, it promised disaster on a scale that would dwarf even the losses of June and July. Yet history is not so simple. The destruction of the Southwestern Front would not break the Soviet Union. It would delay the German drive on Moscow, pushing the advance into the bitter cold of autumn and winter. What seemed a triumph for Hitler in September would, in hindsight, reveal itself as a fatal mistake. As August ended and September began, the soldiers on both sides could not know the full consequences of what was unfolding. They only knew that the battle for Kyiv had begun, and that survival, for both armies and nations, would come at a price written in blood. So I'll leave you with this question. Was Hitler's decision to send Guderian south to Kyiv his greatest victory, or the mistake that doomed him before Moscow? History may never answer fully, but it reminds us that even the most brilliant triumphs can carry within them the seeds of ultimate defeat.